There are moments in a man's life that divide his existence into before and after. I had such a moment on a September evening in 1918 when I was 16 years old. I have carried the weight of what I saw for 68 years, and in all that time I have never spoken of it to a living soul, not to my wife, who died thinking she knew everything about me, not to my children, who believed their father to be an honest man, not even to the preacher, though I have sat in his church every Sunday for more than half a century, listening to him speak of truth and confession and the unburdening of the soul. My name is Thomas Edmund Price. I was born in March of 1902 in a small house on the outskirts of Willow Creek, West Virginia. It was coal country then, as it is now, though the mines have mostly closed and the people have mostly left. My father worked underground for the Consolidated Coal Company. My mother took in washing and mending to help make ends meet. I was the middle child of 7, with 3 brothers and 3 sisters, though only 5 of us survived to adulthood. We were not poor by the standards of that time and place, but we were far from comfortable. We had a roof that kept out most of the rain, food on the table most nights, and clothes that were patched but serviceable. My father brought home a paycheck every 2 weeks when the mines were operating, and we stretched it as far as it would go. I left school after the 6th grade, as most boys did in those days. There was no shame in it and no expectation of anything different. Education was a luxury for people who did not need to work, and we needed to work. By the time I was 12, I was doing odd jobs around town, delivering groceries, chopping wood, helping farmers with their harvests. By 14, I was working part-time at the lumber mill. By 16, I was expecting to go into the mines like my father, though the thought filled me with a dread I could not name. The year 1918 was a strange and difficult time. The war in Europe was still raging, though we would not know for another 2 months that it was nearly over. Men from our town had gone to fight, and some had not come back. The influenza was beginning to spread, though it had not yet reached our valley in full force. There was a sense in the air that the world was changing in ways we could not control or understand. I was 16 years old that September, on the cusp of manhood, but not quite there yet. I was tall for my age and strong from work, but I still had the uncertainty of youth, the feeling that I did not yet know who I was or what I would become. I remember that feeling very clearly, the sense that my life was still unformed, still waiting to take shape. I did not know that it was about to be marked by something I could never explain. Willow Creek was a small mining town tucked into a narrow valley in the Appalachian foothills. The creek that gave the town its name ran through the center of the valley, winding between steep ridges covered in oak and pine. The water was clear and cold, fed by springs higher up in the mountains, and in the summer, children would swim in the deeper pools while their mothers did washing on the banks. Our house sat on the eastern edge of town, a weathered clapboard structure that my grandfather had built before I was born. It had 4 rooms and a loft where the boys slept. The walls were thin, and in winter you could see your breath indoors until the stove had been burning for an hour or more. But it was home, and it was ours, and we were grateful for it. The town itself was built around the mines. There was a company store, a post office, a church, a schoolhouse, and perhaps 24 houses scattered along the creek and up the slopes of the valley. Most of the men worked underground. Most of the women worked at home. Life followed a rhythm dictated by the whistle at the mine. 7 in the morning for the day shift, 3 in the afternoon for the swing shift, 11 at night for the graveyard shift. On Sundays, the whistle was silent, and the whole town went to church. We were Methodist, most of us, though there were a few Baptist families and 1 or 2 Catholic households. After church, families would gather for Sunday dinner, and in the afternoon the men would sit on porches and talk while the women cleaned up and the children played in the yards or down by the creek. It was a hard life, but it was the only life we knew, and there was a kind of comfort in its predictability. You knew what each day would bring. You knew what was expected of you. You knew your place in the order of things. My days in those years followed a simple pattern. I woke before dawn and helped my father with the morning chores, splitting wood, hauling water, tending to the chickens and the hog we kept penned behind the house. I ate a quick breakfast of cornmeal mush or biscuits, and then I walked to the lumber mill, where I worked from 7 in the morning until 5 in the evening, 6 days a week. The work was hard and monotonous. I stacked boards, swept sawdust, operated the sorting table, did whatever needed doing. The air was thick with dust, and the noise of the saws was constant and deafening. By the end of each day, my clothes were soaked with sweat and covered in wood shavings, my hands were rough and splintered, and my ears rang with the echo of machinery. But I was young and strong, and the work did not break me. I took pride in doing it well, in earning my pay, in contributing to my family's survival. In the evenings, I would walk home through the gathering dusk, wash up at the pump in the yard, and eat supper with my family at the long wooden table in our kitchen. After supper, if there was light enough, I might read for a while. I had a few books that I had gotten from the traveling library that came through town twice a year. Or I might sit on the porch with my father and brothers, listening to the sounds of the valley settling into night. On Saturdays, after work, I sometimes walked down to the creek with friends. We would fish or skip stones or just sit on the bank and talk about nothing in particular. Girls we liked, jobs we hoped to get, places we dreamed of seeing someday, though most of us knew we would probably never leave this valley. There was a girl I was sweet on that summer, a girl named Sarah Miller, whose father worked in the mine office. She had dark hair and green eyes, and a way of laughing that made me forget how tired I was. I would see her at church on Sundays, and sometimes, if I was lucky, I would walk her home afterward. We never spoke of courting or marriage. We were both too young for that. But I thought about her often, and I believed she thought about me too. Life was simple and hard and predictable, and I expected it to remain that way for as long as I lived. I expected to work at the mill for a few more years, then go into the mines. I expected to marry Sarah or someone like her. I expected to raise a family in this valley, in a house like the one I grew up in. I expected to grow old doing work that wore down my body but provided for the people I loved. I expected the world to make sense. I expected that the things I saw with my eyes could be explained by reason or by faith or by the accumulated wisdom of generations. I remember that certainty very clearly. The feeling that I understood how the world worked, that there were no mysteries that could not eventually be solved. It was a Saturday in mid-September, a day I remember as clearly as if it were yesterday. The air had that particular quality that comes in early autumn in the mountains, crisp and clean, with a hint of wood smoke from the stoves people had begun lighting again in the mornings. The leaves on the trees were just beginning to turn, showing patches of yellow and red among the green. I woke that morning to the sound of my father moving around downstairs, preparing for his shift at the mine. I dressed quickly in the dim light of the loft, climbed down the ladder, and joined him in the kitchen. My mother was already at the stove, frying eggs and sausage. The smell filled the small room, mixing with the scent of coffee brewing in the pot on the back of the stove. We ate breakfast mostly in silence, as we usually did. My father was not a talkative man, especially before work, and I had learned to respect his quiet. After we ate, he gathered his lunch pail and his work clothes and headed out the door. I heard his boots on the porch, then the sound of him walking down the path toward town. I had the day off from the mill. Saturdays were half days in summer, but by September we had Saturdays off entirely unless there was a special order to fill. I spent the morning doing chores around the house. I split wood for the stove, repaired a section of fence that had come loose, and helped my mother hang washing on the line in the yard. By early afternoon, I was finished with my work and had a few hours of freedom before supper. I decided to walk down to the creek. It was a warm day, warmer than usual for September, and I thought I might go for a swim in one of the deep pools, or at least sit by the water and enjoy the weather while it lasted. I told my mother where I was going, grabbed a piece of bread and some cheese from the kitchen for a snack, and set off down the path that led from our house toward the center of town. The path wound through a stand of oak trees, then down a slope to where the creek ran wide and shallow over a bed of smooth stones. I could hear the water before I saw it, the constant rush and murmur that was the background music of our lives in that valley. As I came out of the trees, I saw the creek stretching before me, the sunlight dancing on its surface, the banks lined with willows and tall grass. I walked along the creek for a while, heading upstream toward a place we called the Deep Bend, where the water had carved out a pool deep enough to swim in. The afternoon was quiet. I saw no one else on the creek, which was unusual for a Saturday, but I did not think much of it at the time. People had their own routines, their own reasons for being where they were or were not. I reached the deep bend and sat down on a flat rock near the edge of the pool. I took off my boots and socks and dangled my feet in the water. It was cold, shockingly cold, even though the air was warm. I ate my bread and cheese and watched the water move past, the endless flow from somewhere upstream to somewhere downstream, a cycle that had been going on long before I was born and would continue long after I was gone. I felt peaceful sitting there, content. The work week was behind me. Sunday in church and the possibility of seeing Sarah were ahead of me. In that moment, I had no worries, no fears, no sense that anything was about to change. I sat there for perhaps an hour, doing nothing, thinking about nothing in particular, just existing in the warmth of the afternoon sun. And then, as the sun began to sink toward the western ridge, and the shadows started to lengthen across the valley, I decided to head back home. I put my socks and boots back on, stood up, and began walking back along the creek toward town. I had no idea that in the next few minutes everything I thought I knew about the world was about to shatter. I was perhaps halfway back to town walking along the creek bank through a stretch where the trees grew thick on both sides, when I noticed the silence. It happened gradually, the way twilight comes on, so that at first I was not even aware of it. But at some point I realized that the sounds of the evening had stopped. The birds that had been singing in the trees were quiet. The insects that had been buzzing in the grass were still. Even the sound of the creek seemed muted, as if the water itself had slowed. I stopped walking and stood still, listening. The silence was absolute. It was not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening. It was something else, something wrong. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, a primitive warning that something was not right. And then I saw the light. It appeared above the creek, perhaps 50 yards ahead of me, hovering in the air above the water. At first, I thought it was the sun reflecting off something, but the sun was behind me, sinking toward the western ridge. This light was coming from ahead, from the east, from a direction where there should have been only trees and shadow. I stopped and stared at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. The light was pale and steady, neither flickering like a flame nor bright like the sun. It was somewhere in between, a soft, silvery glow that seemed to emanate from a point in the air above the water. It did not cast shadows on the ground or on the trees. It simply existed, hanging there, impossible and undeniable. I stood frozen, watching it, my mind struggling to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. The light began to move. It drifted slowly upstream, following the course of the creek, staying about 10 or 15 feet above the water. It moved with a strange, smooth motion, neither rising nor falling, maintaining its height and position relative to the creek bed as if tethered to the water itself. I felt my heart begin to pound in my chest. My mouth went dry. My legs felt weak, as if they might give out beneath me. I wanted to run, but I could not move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching this impossible thing drift slowly toward me. As it drew closer, I could see it more clearly. The light was not round like the sun or a lamp flame. It was elongated, almost cylindrical, perhaps 6 feet long and a foot or so in diameter. It glowed with that same pale silvery light, and as it moved, it seemed to pulse very slightly, growing fractionally brighter, and then dimmer, like the slow beating of a heart. The silence around me deepened. I realized I could no longer hear the creek at all, even though I was standing right next to it. I could not hear my own breathing. I could not hear anything except a faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears, like the sound you hear after a loud noise, except there had been no loud noise. The light came closer. When it was perhaps 20 feet away from me, it stopped. It hung there in the air, motionless, pulsing very faintly. I stared at it, and though it had no eyes, no face, no features of any kind, I felt with absolute certainty that it was aware of me, that it was looking at me, observing me, studying me. I tried to speak, to call out, to say something, anything, but my voice would not come. My throat felt paralyzed. I could not even swallow. Time seemed to stop. I do not know how long I stood there, staring at the light and feeling it stare back at me. It might have been seconds. It might have been minutes. There was no way to measure it. The world had narrowed to just two things, me and this light. facing each other in a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. And then, without warning, the light began to rise. It drifted upward, slowly at first, maintaining its position above the creek, but ascending toward the canopy of trees that arched over the water. As it rose, it seemed to grow slightly brighter, the pale glow intensifying to something almost white. It passed through the branches of the trees without disturbing them, without making a sound, and continued upward into the darkening sky. I tilted my head back and watched it go, my neck craned, my eyes straining to follow it as it climbed higher and higher. It grew smaller as it ascended, dwindling to a point of light among the first stars that were beginning to appear in the eastern sky. And then it was gone. The silence broke all at once. The sound of the creek rushed back into my ears. I could hear birds calling in the distance. I could hear the wind moving through the trees. I could hear my own ragged breathing coming in short, shallow gasps. My legs gave out, and I sat down hard on the ground, my whole body shaking. I sat there for a long time, staring at the spot where the light had been, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it had not been real, that there was some rational explanation for what I had seen. But I knew I had not imagined it. I knew what I had seen, and I knew even then that I could never tell anyone about it. I do not know how long I sat there on the creek bank, trembling and trying to understand what had just happened. The world around me had returned to normal, the sounds of evening, the movement of water, the fading light of dusk. But I felt as though I had been pulled out of the normal flow of time and then dropped back into it, disoriented and shaken. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. My legs were unsteady, and I had to lean against a tree for a moment to keep from falling. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely control them. I felt cold, though the evening was still warm. I started walking back toward town, moving slowly, one foot in front of the other, not trusting my balance. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen, trying to fit it into some framework of understanding. Had it been a trick of the light? Some natural phenomenon I had never encountered before? Swamp gas, perhaps, or some kind of electrical discharge from the rocks? But even as I tried to convince myself of these explanations, I knew they were wrong. I had seen what I had seen. The light had been real. It had moved with intention. It had stopped and hovered as if observing me. And then it had risen into the sky and disappeared. There was no natural explanation for that. As I walked, I became aware of how quiet the valley seemed. The mines had finished their shifts for the day, and the evening whistle had not yet blown. Most people were home, preparing for supper. The path was empty. I saw no one. I was grateful for that. I did not think I could speak to anyone just then. I did not think I could form words or make sense or behave in any way that would not seem strange. By the time I reached our house, full darkness had fallen. I could see lamplight in the windows, and I could smell food cooking, my mother preparing supper. I stood in the yard for a moment, trying to compose myself, trying to steady my breathing and stop my hands from shaking. I thought about going inside and telling my family what I had seen. I imagined sitting at the table and describing the light above the creek. I imagined my father's face, the skepticism and concern. I imagined my mother's worry. I imagined my brothers and sisters looking at me as if I had lost my mind, and I knew I could not do it. I knew they would not believe me. They would think I was lying or mistaken or ill. They would worry about me. They might even take me to see a doctor, and the doctor would say there was something wrong with my mind. So I went inside and said nothing. My mother asked me if I was feeling all right. She said I looked pale. I told her I was fine, just tired from the day. She put her hand on my forehead, checking for fever, but found none. She told me to sit down and eat, that I would feel better after I had some food. I sat at the table and forced myself to eat, though the food tasted like nothing, and every bite was an effort to swallow. I answered questions when spoken to, nodded at appropriate times, tried to act normal, but inside I felt like I was coming apart. I felt like the world had revealed itself to be something other than what I had always believed it to be, and I did not know how to live in this new world where impossible things could happen. That night, I lay in my bed in the loft, staring at the darkness, listening to my brothers breathing in their sleep around me. I closed my eyes and saw the light again, hovering above the creek, pulsing with that strange silvery glow. I tried to pray, but the words would not come. I tried to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, I made a decision. I would not speak of what I had seen. I would bury it deep inside myself and never let it out. I would go on with my life as if nothing had happened. And I would hope that with time the memory would fade and I could convince myself it had all been a dream. But the memory did not fade. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to push what I had seen out of my mind. I went to work at the mill. I did my chores. I went to church on Sundays. I spoke to Sarah when I saw her, though I felt a distance between us that had not been there before, as if I were standing on one side of a wall and she and everyone else were on the other. I wanted desperately to tell someone. The secret felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But every time I thought about speaking, I heard in my mind what the response would be. My father would tell me I had been seeing things, that I was overtired or had been out in the sun too long. He would tell me to put it out of my mind and not speak nonsense. My mother would worry. She would think I was ill. She would make me drink bitter tonics and keep me home from work, watching me with anxious eyes. My friends would laugh. They would tease me about seeing ghosts or being afraid of the dark. They would repeat the story to others, and I would become known as the boy who saw things that were not there. And Sarah, I could not bear to think of what Sarah would think. She was practical and sensible, the daughter of an educated man who worked in an office. She would think I was simple-minded or prone to flights of fancy. She would stop walking with me after church. She would turn her attention to someone else. So I stayed silent. But the silence had a cost. I began to have trouble sleeping. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, seeing the light in my mind's eye. When I did sleep, I had dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams in which the light appeared again, hovering over the creek, waiting for me. I became withdrawn. My mother noticed and asked me several times if something was troubling me. I told her I was fine, just thinking about the future, about whether I should go into the mines or try to find other work. She seemed to accept this explanation, though I could see the worry in her eyes. The world around me seemed to have lost some of its solidity. I found myself looking at ordinary things, trees, sky, water, and wondering what else might be hidden just beyond the edge of perception. I felt as though I had glimpsed something that most people never saw, and now I could not unsee it. 3 weeks after the incident at the creek, I went back to the place where it had happened. I do not know what I expected to find. Some evidence, perhaps, some mark or sign that would prove I had not imagined it. But there was nothing. The creek looked exactly as it always had. The trees were the same. The rocks, the water, the bank, everything was ordinary and unremarkable. I sat on the same flat rock where I had sat that afternoon, and I waited, half hoping and half fearing that the light would appear again. But it did not. The evening came on normally. The birds sang, the creek flowed, the sun set behind the western ridge, and the stars came out, and there was nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I walked home in the darkness, feeling both relieved and disappointed. Over the following months, the intensity of the memory began to fade, though it never disappeared entirely. I learned to live with it, to carry it inside me like a stone in my pocket, always there but not always noticed. I went on with my life. I turned 17, then 18. I continued working at the mill. The war in Europe ended. The influenza came and went, taking some people from our valley, but sparing most. Life continued in its familiar rhythms. Sarah and I began courting more seriously. By the time I was 19, we were talking about marriage. By 20, we were engaged. We married in the spring of 1922 in the Methodist Church in Willow Creek, with our families and friends in attendance. I was happy on my wedding day. I loved Sarah, and she loved me, and I believed we would have a good life together. But even as I stood at the altar and said my vows, a part of me was holding something back. There was a piece of myself that I could not give to her, a secret I could not share, a wall I could not break down. I told myself it did not matter, that what I had seen that September evening was separate from the life Sarah and I were building together, that it was a thing apart, contained and sealed off, unable to touch the present. But that was not entirely true, because the memory of that light and the knowledge that I had witnessed something impossible and inexplicable changed me in ways I did not fully understand. It made me cautious. It made me question. It made me aware that the world was larger and stranger and more mysterious than I had been taught to believe, and I could never speak of it. Not to Sarah, who I loved more than anyone, not to my children when they came, not to anyone. The silence became a part of who I was. Sarah and I had 4 children, 3 daughters, and a son. I worked in the mines for 37 years, following in my father's footsteps as I had always known I would. We raised our family in Willow Creek in a house not far from the one I grew up in. We were active in the church. We had friends and neighbors and a place in the community. To anyone looking from the outside, we had a good life, a normal life, the kind of life that most people in that time and place lived, with its share of hardships and joys, sorrows and satisfactions. But there was always a distance inside me, a part of myself that I held back even from the people I loved most. Sarah noticed it, I think, though she never said so directly. There were times when she would look at me with a question in her eyes, as if she sensed that I was not entirely present, that some piece of me was elsewhere. She would ask me what I was thinking about, and I would say, "Nothing, just work," or "Nothing important." And she would nod and let it go, though I could see she did not entirely believe me. I was a good husband and a good father, I think. I provided for my family. I was faithful to my wife. I taught my children what I knew about work and responsibility and doing what was right. But I was not fully open with them. There was always something I kept locked away, something I could not share. As the years passed, the memory of that September evening became less immediate, less vivid. It receded into the background of my mind like an old photograph that has faded with time. But it never disappeared entirely. It was always there, waiting in quiet moments to resurface. I would be working underground in the mine, alone in a side tunnel, and suddenly I would remember the silence that had fallen over the creek that evening, and I would stop what I was doing and listen, half expecting to hear that same unnatural quiet. I would be sitting on the porch on a summer evening, watching the sun set behind the ridge, and I would remember the light rising into the sky, and I would search the stars, looking for something that should not be there. I would be lying next to Sarah in bed at night, listening to her breathe in her sleep, and I would think about telling her, about finally speaking the words I had held inside for so many years. But I never did. I could not bear the thought of her doubting me, or worse, believing me, and being as burdened by the knowledge as I was. The secret became a kind of companion, a silent presence that went with me everywhere. It shaped the way I saw the world. It made me skeptical of certainties, wary of explanations that claimed to account for everything. It made me humble in the face of mystery. When people spoke with confidence about what was possible and what was not, about what could exist and what could not, I would nod and say nothing. But inside I would think, "You do not know. You cannot know. The world is stranger than you imagine." Sarah died in 1978 after 56 years of marriage. She was 74 years old. I held her hand as she passed, and with her last breath I thought about telling her the truth, about whispering in her ear the secret I had kept all those decades. But I did not. I let her go, without ever knowing the full truth of who I was. After she died, I moved in with my youngest daughter and her family. They take care of me now, though I can still take care of myself for the most part. They think of me as a simple man, a retired coal miner with simple needs and simple thoughts. They have no idea what I carry inside me. I am 84 years old now. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and my eyesight is failing, and I wake most mornings with aches in my joints that will not go away. I know I do not have much time left. A few years, perhaps, maybe less. And I have decided that I cannot die without speaking of what I saw. I do not expect anyone to believe me. I would not believe me if our positions were reversed. But I need to say it anyway. I need to put it into words, to give it form outside my own mind, to make it real in a way that it has never been real before. On a September evening in 1918, when I was 16 years old, I saw a light above Willow Creek that should not have existed. It was not the sun or the moon or any natural thing I had ever encountered. It hovered in the air, glowing with a pale, silvery light, and it moved with intention and awareness. It observed me as I observed it, and then it rose into the sky and disappeared among the stars. I have carried the memory of that light for 68 years. I have thought about it thousands of times, turned it over in my mind, examined it from every angle, tried to find some explanation that would make sense of it. But there is no explanation. There is only what I saw. I am writing this down now in the last years of my life because I cannot bear to take it with me to the grave. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to hear this testimony and decide for themselves what it means. I do not know what the light was. I do not know where it came from or why it appeared to me that evening. I do not know if anyone else has ever seen it, or if I was the only witness to something that should not have been witnessed, but I know what I saw. And I know that I have lived my entire life in the shadow of that moment, carrying a secret that separated me from everyone I loved. That is the truth. That is my confession. I still go down to the creek sometimes when the weather is good and my legs are strong enough to make the walk. I sit on the bank and watch the water flow past just as I did when I was a boy. And I look up at the sky, especially in the evening when the first stars are appearing, and I search for the light. I do not expect to see it again. I think it came to me once and only once, for reasons I will never understand. But I look anyway, because the possibility is there, and because I cannot help myself. What was it? Where did it come from? Why did it appear above our small creek in our small valley in the mountains of West Virginia? I have no answers. I have only the memory and the certainty that I saw something that defied everything I had been taught about the nature of reality. I am an old man now, and soon I will be gone. The people who knew me will remember me as a coal miner, a husband, a father, a churchgoer. They will think they knew me, but they did not, because I carried a secret my entire life, and I never spoke of it until now. I saw the light above the creek, and I will die not knowing what it was.